The Old Testament has been copied and recopied and copied again so many times. How can we be really sure that when we read our Old Testament, we are reading what was originally written? Next, on So What? Hi, I'm Chris Dorman, and welcome back to So What? Did that introduction sound familiar? Well, if you've been watching these podcasts, it should, because I said essentially that very same thing a few weeks ago when I was looking at the copies and the manuscript evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. We've spent several weeks now looking at the historical reliability of your New Testament. We spent the last couple of weeks looking at some of the common myths, misconceptions, and downright lies about your New Testament, questioning its reliability, its integrity, whether or not we can trust it. We can trust it, right? And why is that important? Because without your New Testament, there is no basis for our Christian faith. Well, Pastor Bob said, "Hey, Chris, thanks for all the information on the New Testament. When are you going to get to the Old Testament?" Ta-da! Today, Pastor Bob. Today is that day. So, unlike the New Testament, when we come to the study of the Old Testament books, there's not nearly as much controversy as there is surrounding the New Testament books. And there's two primary reasons for that I want to discuss today. The first is the Masoretes, or are the Masoretes. The Masoretes were a group of scribes that lived around 500 or so AD to about 1,000 or so AD. And these guys copied the Bible. And their manuscript is incredibly reliable. In fact, some argue that the Masoretic text of the Old Testament is the most reliable Old Testament manuscript in existence. Why do they say that? Because the Masoretes had some crazy rules for copying. Crazy rules. For example, if you had to copy the Old Testament day in and day out, okay, and that was your living, do you think you'd have some parts of it memorized? Do you think there's some passages like Genesis 1:1, for example, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? Do you think you'd have that memorized? Well, the scribes who copied the Old Testament, the Masoretes, they were not allowed to write down anything from memory. So let's say they get to Psalm 46, okay? And they're going to write down, they're going to copy verse 10, which is Pastor Scott's favorite verse in the Bible. Be still and know that I am God. Do you think they had that memorized? They probably did. It didn't matter. They were not allowed to write anything down from memory. So what they had to do is they had to look at the master text, read a word, say that one word out loud, and then write that one word down. Then go back to the master text, read that second word, say that second word out loud, and then write down that second word. And they did that for every word of every verse of every chapter of every book in the Old Testament. It would take months and months to complete copying a large book of the Old Testament. Can you imagine that? They couldn't write anything down from memory. But more crazy stuff than that. These guys were so careful. For example, what the copyist would do is they would write down the number of key words in a given book. For example, in the book of Genesis, how many times was the name Abraham mentioned? Well, they would write that down at the end and say, so when you're reading this, you should see the name of Abraham X number of times. They would write that down. They would also write down the numerical equivalent of the words in each book. What the heck does that mean? Think about it like this. Each Hebrew letter has a numerical equivalent. For example, the letter A is the first letter in the English alphabet, right? Let's say the letter A is number 1, letter B, number 2, letter C, number 3, right? Okay, makes sense? Hebrew alphabet, same thing. So every word was composed of letters. Those letters had a total, right? You'd add up, so each word had a numerical equivalent. They would write down the numerical equivalent of all the words in the text that they were copying, and they would keep track of that and write that down as well. They would also keep track of the number of passages, okay? They would also write down the word that is the numerical equivalent of each book that they were copying. So let's say a book, the numerical equivalent was like 100,000, okay? They would find the word or the phrase that was at 50,000 and write that down as well. So let's say they spent 6 months copying Isaiah or something, okay? They're done. Then a second scribe would come along and just looking at the copy would check the number of verses, would check the key phrase or word if it was at the middle, They would check down the numerical equivalent of all the words in the copy to make sure everything the scribe wrote down matched itself. Okay? If it didn't, boom, can't use it. Can't use it for study or official official use in religious training. Could not be used. And the guy would have to start all over again. Okay? You imagine that? You spend 6 months, find an error, boom, can't use it, start again. Okay? Well, let's say the second scribe checks out everything in that book and everything is perfect. Then that scribe would take that copy and compare it to the master text and start all over again. Everything would be double and triple checked. Okay? It didn't matter that the copy matched itself. If the copy differed from the master, boom, could not be used. Toss it out. Start again. Were they careful? Yeah, they were careful. Were they accurate? That's the question. In fact, until about 70 years or so ago, we really did not know how accurate the Masoretes were. In 1947, a young boy exploring some caves near Qumran, and that's on the north shore of the Dead Sea, was exploring some caves, and in those caves, he came across hundreds and hundreds of parchments of ancient Hebrew writings. Okay? These findings are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have you ever heard of them? Well, in these Dead Scrolls were, among other things, multiple copies of just about every single book of the Old Testament. And the important thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that these scrolls are dated to about 100 BC to 100 AD. So in other words, they are 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text, okay? 1,000 years closer in time to when the Old Testament was written. How many changes in theology do you think they found? How many major doctrinal differences do you think they found when they took 1,000 years off the copying? Not even one. Zero. Not even one. So after they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, people stopped arguing about whether or not the Old Testament copies were accurate. They couldn't anymore, right? They knock 1,000 years off, it's basically the same. No point in arguing. Okay. So why is this important? A few weeks ago, one of the very first podcasts I actually did in So What was about the importance of the Old Testament. Do you remember that? If you didn't see it, I encourage you to go back and watch it because you see, beloved, many times as Christians, we neglect the Old Testament. And yet, remember when Jesus was walking on the Emmaus Road and he was talking to those two disciples who were upset and sad about his passing, what did he do? He opened up the scriptures. He opened up the Old Testament and showed them himself. What did Paul say? He said the scriptures are useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, right? What scriptures was he referring to? Of course, he was referring to the Old Testament. Do you want to grow in righteousness? Do you want to understand the person and works of your God? Do you want to see the faithfulness of God from the beginnings of time? Then you got to study your Old Testament. Don't neglect it. It will enrich your Christian life. And now you know there's no basis to not trust it. It's absolutely trustworthy in every way. All right. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you next week.